A successful insurance adjuster, Fletcher Morrison, loses his family, home, and career after his wife engineers a divorce using fabricated gambling evidence. Forced back into his late mother's modest home, Fletcher discovers a hidden safe containing cash, false identities, and a letter revealing that his mother entered witness protection years earlier after testifying against mobsters who killed his real father. The lies protecting him were deliberate. With federal marshals and his wife's eventual cooperation, the conspiracy is exposed, Fletcher's name is cleared, and he prepares to finish his family's fight against organized crime, honoring his mother's sacrifice. The house on the hill looked like an invitation. Glass railings, a ribbon of light from the kitchen island, a skyline blurred by distance. Fletcher watched the city glitter as if he could will his life back into order with the same hand that once signed off on insurance claims and closing statements. The photographs on the mantel, graduation caps, a wedding portrait, two kids cropped mid-laughter, taped the world together. Cordelia moved through the rooms like a practice director, hair perfect, voice measured. Their children's laughter leaked from the upstairs, Quinlan's basketball thuds, Brenna's quiet giggles over a sketchbook. It should have been a Sunday morning frozen in amber. Instead, it was cold in ways no thermostat could fix. Cordelia's recent phone calls had a way of folding the air between them, and Fletcher learned the rhythm of her absences the way sailors learn tides. A dutiful kiss on her cheek became a scheduled thing. He kept inventory of small losses, a hand that no longer reached for his during movies, an empty side of the bed that had once been warmth. He told himself 1,000 conciliatory lies: work stress, exhaustion, the weather. The house remained immaculate. Their marriage turned into a sculpture, beautiful but brittle. When the first lawyer's envelope arrived at 7:30, the morning was ordinary: coffee, the paper, the smell of toast. The bell cut the air and Fletcher assumed it was a delivery. He opened the door to a man with the prick of professional duty in his hands and a paper that read like a verdict. Felony allegations, he read later from the page. Fletcher's mouth dried the way a man's does when a world you built is suddenly not yours. Cordelia did not look up when he held the papers. The way she folded them into a tote bag was clinical. "It's the only way," she said. The phrase landed like an accusation and a confession. He watched the courtroom as if from the cheap seats of a theater. Witnesses were summoned like actors. Receipts and statements flickered up on screens like evidence from a life he didn't recognize. A supposed trail of gambling losses mapped a shadow version of himself he could not find in the mirror. Quinlan listened to other people speak about his father's character and folded inward. Brenna's hand found her mother's in the gallery and clung like a tiny lifeline. Fletcher watched his name become a headline on other people's mouths. 3 months later, he pulled into a driveway that smelled of cut grass and sunscreen, not of eucalyptus and smog. The little ranch hadn't changed. His mother's porch swing hung still, icons of a life that never needed to shout. Inside the rooms, lavender lingered in air that had stored 1,000 quiet afternoons. The little things, a bookmark peeking from a mystery novel, a mismatched teacup in the sink, were not reminders of what he had lost, but clues of what had been kept safe for him. This house had room for everything, including secrets. The decision to stay was practical at first: a roof, a mailbox that still knew his name. But there was more to it, a pull he couldn't name. The city felt like a life he'd been exiled from, while this house felt like a place that remembered him better than he remembered himself. As he pushed open the basement door to look for tools he needed for repairs, the fluorescent bulb hummed and the smell of old paper rose like a tide. He found boxes of childhood projects, envelopes labeled in his mother's slow script, and, tucked back, where a furnace's shadow softened the wall, the scrape marks of something moved recently. The world had not yet told him what the scrape meant. He reached for the dust, and for the first time in months, a question opened in him that felt like a breakable hinge. Daylight in Akron had a particular cold clarity. It cut through the house and settled on the same coffee table where his mother's glasses lay. Fletcher set his hands on the worn armchair and listened to the quiet like a foreign language he almost remembered. He began with small repairs, sanding the banister, tightening a hinge, tasks whose progress could be measured in hours, not courtroom dates. The work steadied him. Each stroke of a paintbrush was a tiny rebellion against the humiliation he'd lived through. Neighbors reappeared like old punctuation marks. Mrs. Patterson brought a pie and remarked on how Fletcher had grown, her voice gentle like someone offering a safe place inside casual conversation. Jerry, the next-door neighbor who once drank beers with him in a younger life, kept distance at first, then brought over a box of tools like a peace offering. Their small kindnesses stitched the edges of his days together while he tried to understand how his life had been dismantled so precisely. But grief has a way of asking questions that practicalities cannot answer. Fletcher kept thinking of the odd things about his mother he had once chalked up to eccentricity. Her odd insistence on precise birthdays and times, the way she always looked to the window whenever a car paused outside, the way she would say certain names with a small, careful reverence. These were oddities he'd folded into family lore. Now they felt deliberate, like bookmarks left for him to find. He began going through the boxes in the basement more methodically, photographs, tax documents, a diary with dates that stopped and started. He found receipts from train tickets, hotel stays under other names, and envelopes that had been never opened. Each discovery loosened a thread. There were also items that didn't fit the picture of a 1960s librarian, a passport, a folded map of cities he had never visited, a list of names and numbers in a handwriting that wavered between familiarity and coded restraint. He told himself, stubbornly, that the truth would be simple. Maybe some long-ago mystery about his father, some family secret that explained more than it complicated. He was wrong. As the house surrendered its secrets, his own past pressed back. Flashed memories, a young boy under blankets listening as his mother whispered on late-night calls, a hurried packing of a suitcase at age 12, the hushed, solemn faces of adults in heavy coats, returned as if the house had been safekeeping for those two painful moments. Fletcher realized his childhood had been anchored in choices he had never understood. Each artifact felt like an evidence tag pinned to his life. Then he found the furnace. It was awkward and heavy, a hulking thing that had always sat innocently in a corner. The concrete beneath it told a different story, fresh scuffs, a faint rectangular shade where something had been hidden. He lifted the unit with a James-like impatience and a tenderness that belonged to men who move their mother's belongings with care and fear. Behind it was a square metal safe, its paint pitted and worn, the numbers on its dials smoothed by fingers long gone. He almost walked away. It wasn't his nature to pry into locked things. But his mother's handwriting on an old envelope tucked into the safe's rim for when you need to know made the lock and its silence into a summons. His hands trembled as he turned the dial with a guess, feeling absurd and desperate in equal measure. The numbers lined up like a promise. The click was quiet but thundered in him. He cracked it open and a breath of paper and old cash lifted like a curtain. For a moment he only saw green and rubber bands and envelopes labeled with names that made no sense. Then he saw the note in his mother's careful script, a name that was not hers. A name that rewired his life. The letters smelled like lavender and paper, like every bedtime story and every rationed comfort his mother had given him. Fletcher unfolded the page with the care of someone handling a relic. The first line, "My dearest Fletcher, if you are reading this, they finally found you," hit with a force that made his knees go weak. The letter did not apologize. It explained, in the clipped, steady sentences of someone trained to be precise, the world he had been living in, new names, federal relocation, the reason his father's death had been called an accident when it had not been. Vincent Castellano, the name swelled in his mouth like a stone. His childhood anchor, an explanation for small, incongruous things, rearranged itself into a map of survival. His father had been murdered by the Torino family. His mother had testified. Their new life had been paid, in part, by the state, safe identities, a nest of money, and rules that kept them small and careful. She had been Wyford Morrison by public record, Isabella Reyes, Maria Santos, and other papers. Each alias had a photo with eyes that matched her looking back at him from different ages, a single person folded into many names. Below the factual account, his mother had written something simpler, softer. I kept you small so the world couldn't see you. I kept enough to make sure you could stand up if you had to. There was a red-inked phone number at the bottom, underlined 3 times, and the name Marshall Theodore Vance. The note told him not to speak, not to leave, and to wait. For the first time since his life unraveled, a path pointed forward. He dialed the number with hands that were mostly steady because they had to be. The voice on the other end was older, worn into the cadence of waiting men who had lived through many reckonings. Son, we've been waiting, Marshall Vance said. He arrived hours later with 2 agents and a somber professionalism that filled Fletcher with both relief and dread. They cataloged the safe like archaeologists at a fragile site, bundles of cash, passports, social security cards paired with aliases, and documents with stamps and signatures that made them real. The agents told Fletcher what his mother had tried to keep him from knowing. The Torino organization was not content to eliminate witnesses anymore. They had learned to destroy lives with legal and financial sabotage, to make people disintegrate without ever firing a bullet. The game had been to isolate a target until the target returned to the one place the mafia suspected might hide evidence. Fletcher listened, a thin reed in a wind of federal certainty. In the quiet of the kitchen, the truth felt both terrifying and clarifying. There was, finally, an enemy he could name. Then the phone buzzed with news that nearly toppled him. Cordelia had been picked up in Portland, not as a mastermind, but as a pawn. She had been in rooms with men who presented themselves as investigators or consultants, professionals who knew how to bend information and fear into motivation. The narrative slotted into place. The fabricated bank statements, the planted witness statements, the calibrated legal blows had been engineered to force him home, to shove him through the same basement door where his mother had hidden the history that might lead to others. Betrayal tasted metallic and hollow. Cordelia, the woman he had loved since adolescence, had been compromised. Was she complicit? Coerced? A victim like him? The answers were neither simple nor immediate. What was immediate was the sensation of a net gathering taut. The story was larger than his divorce, the private ugliness a signal flare to men who hid behind suits and threats. The agents asked him not to contact anyone, not even his children, until they had a plan. But the walls of Fletcher's old house did not keep the world away. Calls came, lawyers with cautious optimism, a neighbor's rumor, a text from a number he did not recognize, each a mosquito at the thin, private skin of his life. He felt both cursed by knowledge and empowered by it. For the first time in months, there was a strategy, not only to survive but to strike back with facts the size of anvils. The safe's money could pay for lawyers. The documents could connect threads others had left loose. His mother had not just left him cash. She had left him a beginning. The days that followed moved with a rigid, procedural cadence. Federal agents came and went, their shoes whispering on hardwood as they photographed artifacts and logged documents into evidence bags. Fletcher sat at the kitchen table at night and tried to breathe in a rhythm that would keep panic from rising. He learned legal jargon faster than he'd ever wanted to: subpoenas, indictments, chain of custody. He learned to count in timelines, who did what, when, where. The safe had become a new center of gravity in his life. Its contents were the only currency that could buy back his children. Cordelia's arrest took place before the media had time to fill in details. She was led from a hotel in Portland, small and shaken, not theatrical, but broken in an intimate way Fletcher had never expected. The photographs of her flinching under the flashbulbs felt like mortar shells. The news said she'd cooperated. Fletcher's chest clambered between relief and a jagged, private fury. Betrayal did not always scream. Sometimes it whispered and manipulated until everything else was rubble. Marshall Vance sat with Fletcher in the living room one evening after a long day of interviews. "Your mother didn't leave you money because she liked money," he said finally. "She left you options. She knew that if the old family wanted to go after witnesses differently, they'd use legal instruments. Your mom was surgical about what she protected." Vance's hands steepled, a gesture of weary certainty. We have enough to show a pattern. That's how we'll move. Fletcher felt the brittle edge of hope sharpen into determination. He had been kept small to be safe. Now being small would not suffice. He was ready to step into the light his mother had once denied him. But the stakes were not only legal. He had to face Quinlan and Brenna, and something about those conversations felt like pulling a splinter that might be lodged in bone. He wanted to tell them everything: the names, the danger, the courage of a woman who had given him a life at the price of constant vigilance, but agents cautioned restraint. Tell them the truth you can, Vance advised. Tell them you're safe and that their mother is cooperating. Save the rest for when we can protect you. The advice was sensible but felt like a betrayal of its own, the raw, human impulse to explain and be understood. The first supervised visit with the kids was staged in a neutral office with gray walls and a box of tissues at the center. Quinlan's eyes skirted to the broken places in the world, the way a teen looks at a fractured photograph. He asked about basketball in clipped sentences and said little. Brenna clung to the back of a chair and drew, her paper full of small houses battered by wind. At the end of the hour, Quinlan hugged his father, quick and a little mechanical, as if testing whether the muscle remembered what it had once known. Fletcher walked back to his car with his hands empty and his heart full of a complicated ache that felt like obligation and love braided together. Legal fights began in courtrooms that smelled vaguely of old polish and stale coffee. He watched depositions like surgical operations, each question a scalpel aimed at exposing the truth. The fake bank statements were examined by forensic accountants. Signatures were tested under magnification. Metadata in files told when and where documents had been created. Cordelia's cooperation yielded recorded meetings in which men promised her safety and financial leverage for her silence. The defense of the Torinos hired proxies was slick, plausible deniability wrapped in complex spreadsheets. But Fletcher's fear of truth, backed by the safe's contents and his mother's prepared trail, began to cohere into something heavy and undeniable. And all the while, Fletcher learned a new language: how to be honest to his children in fragments, how to hold himself steady while waiting for the next legal turn, how to translate fear into a plan. The money from the safe paid for private counsel who understood the dark art of organized sabotage. The counsel pushed, sued, subpoenaed. Fletcher found himself standing taller not because he was healed, but because he had purpose. He would not be merely reclaimed, he would be restored in the public ledger of his life. But the restoration would demand a cost: testimony, exposure, danger for himself and for the few allies who remained. The trial felt less like an event and more like a reckoning. In the sterile lighting of the courtroom, Fletcher took the stand and felt the floor beneath his feet become the only honest thing he could trust. He spoke slowly at first, his name, his childhood, the truth about who raised him and why. Then the letter, the safe, the aliases. He watched faces, counted breaths. A hush thickened the room like thunderclouds before lightning. For weeks he had rehearsed the parts of his story he would share, the pieces that would pierce the armor of manufactured evidence. Truth, he learned, had a way of being mundane and devastating all at once. Cordelia sat to the side. She had chosen to testify against those who had used her, and there was something in her posture that suggested a woman laid bare, not by display but by remorse. Her voice in cross-examination wavered but held. She explained how she'd been approached, groomed with fear and false documents, how the men had promised the safety of the children in exchange for leverage. For Fletcher, her testimony felt like a thin bridge between accusation and absolution. Then came the forensics. A document expert demonstrated how a cash flow ledger had been synthesized from disparate files, timestamps staggered, fonts mismatched. One by one, the pillars of Cordelia's original case toppled. Witnesses who'd once signed affidavits confessed to coaching and payoffs. The prosecution's case against the Torino organization, much larger in scope than Fletcher's personal craze, revealed a system designed to weaponize bureaucracy itself. The judge watched it unfold, face a practiced mask of gravity. In the gallery, Quinlan leaned forward as if pulled by a thread tied to his father's words. Brenna's sketchbook rested on her knees, the drawings calmer than they had been. When the judge read the verdict clearing Fletcher of the fabricated debts and reinstating his professional license, some small, fragile part of him nodded. It did not erase the months of humiliation, the nights of hunger, the quiet poverty of being accused. But it confirmed something essential. The truth holds weight. Outside the courthouse, flashes from cameras turned faces into momentary constellations. Cordelia approached Fletcher with hands that trembled and offered an apology that felt too taut to contain all the guilt. He could have shaped his answer into a retribution or revenge. Instead, he touched his children first, letting them know, in small human terms, that they were safe and that the people who'd hurt them had been named. He forgave her in a way that was both practical and private, an agreement to co-parent and protect their children together, not to reconcile a marriage that had been broken into too many shards to fit back together. But the trial's real victory was larger. The case against the Torino family gained momentum because witnesses found courage in Fletcher's story. Men and women who had been quiet in small fear decided to speak. Federal indictments expanded. The criminal enterprise that had learned to hide behind litigious and legal machinations now faced a courtroom that could pull the curtain away. That night, Fletcher stood in the quiet of his mother's kitchen and allowed himself to feel exhaustion as a kind of baptism. There was still danger, still work to do. The family would require protection, testimony would continue, the trial's next phases awaited, but for the first time since the doorway bell had rung with that initial envelope, he felt aligned with a truth he could defend. He held his children close and let the small, ordinary gestures fill the space that accusation had emptied. The path ahead was dangerous and uncertain, but the person walking it was no longer a man defined by loss alone. He was someone tasked with finishing a fight his mother had started. Months later, the house on Maple Street changed. Not its bones, those remained the same, steadfast and plain, but its air shifted. Where it once held the hush of a woman who kept secrets to protect, it now felt like a room that had learned how to breathe with the windows open. Fletcher painted the front porch in a careful pale, the color of small, stubborn hope. Quinlan practiced jump shots on the cracked driveway and laughed with the kind of uncomplicated courage teenagers reclaim when danger fades. Brenna filled sketchbooks with warmer colors, her drawings less storm-tossed, more sunlit. There were scars. Cordelia's pain threaded through the house like an echo. Therapy sessions with the children were a ritual as regular as dinner, and honesty slotted into daily life in manageable pieces. Fletcher didn't pretend the past hadn't hurt. He taught his kids to name it and to hold it as a part of their story, not the whole thing. He'd been given back his work, his professional license restored with a formal apology, but the man who returned to Pasadena did so differently. He measured success by how present he could be, by how candidly he could teach his kids to recognize the difference between fear and manipulation. The trial against the Torino family ground on in larger venues, dragging shadows into daylight. Men who once thought themselves untouchable learned, slowly and painfully, that institutions could adapt, that evidence could be constructed to reveal corruption as readily as it had been used to conceal it. Fletcher was scheduled to testify again, not just about the safe or bank statements, but about a life lived small so others could live free. He prepared like someone carrying both grief and gratitude. On the anniversary of his mother's death, he sat on the porch with a thermos of coffee and the same old chair that had held her. He thought of the tent in their backyard when he was a boy, the constellations she'd named for him, the way she'd always said, "You find a way when someone loves you." He had found a way, but it had cost him everything. Yet in that cost lay a fuller reckoning, gratitude for a mother whose bravery had been quiet and ceaseless, acceptance that the life she'd made for him was not an erasure of danger, but a new language for surviving it. Before he left for court, he unlocked a box he'd kept in his closet, the small, ready-to number their family had once sworn never to call without cause. He dialed Marshall Vance and left a message that was both a promise and a benediction. "We'll finish it," he said. "We'll finish it together." Outside, Quinlan called for a practice layup. Brenna ran inside with a new sketch, a home standing through a storm, windows bright. Fletcher pinned it to the refrigerator with a magnet and let himself smile. Not because the story had a neat ending, but because the next chapter had been chosen with intention. His mother's last line had been a command and an embrace. Sometimes the worst thing that happens leads you exactly where you need to be. He felt that truth like a pulse under his skin, painful, steady, and inevitably forward.